In the waning years of the Civil War, the southern countryside was a place of shadows and rumors. Small towns whispered of a woman who could appear and vanish like smoke, a specter who haunted the paths of both soldier and scout alike. Her name was Mara Ellison, though few had ever heard it spoken aloud. Even fewer had lived to see her face and walk away to tell the tale. The stories that traveled from plantation to plantation, from Confederate camp to Confederate camp, spoke of deeds so extraordinary that some refused to believe them. Mara was said to have been born into bondage, the daughter of a woman sold repeatedly through the South and a man whose name she never knew. From her earliest memories, she had been acquainted with cruelty, the lash, the cold stare of overseers, the calculated cruelty of masters who saw flesh and labor as a commodity rather than human life. Her childhood was not one of education or tenderness, but of observation, caution, and survival. She learned the ways of the fields, not only to work but to move undetected, to notice every detail, the direction of the wind, the flight of birds, the rustle of leaves that might signify a footstep not her own. She watched the soldiers, too, their movements predictable and yet dangerous. The knowledge she amassed would later serve as her armor, her weapon, and her legend. Mara's mother had been a quiet woman, sharp-eyed and stoic, whose survival depended on silence. She had taught Mara the basics of reading and listening, though in secret, because even the whisper of intelligence in the wrong ears could mean punishment or death. From her, Mara learned patience, observation, and the power of memory. Every face she saw, every routine she noted, every cadence of speech was recorded, stored like a map of potential dangers. Her father's identity was a mystery, a void in her existence, leaving her with questions that were as dangerous as the truth might have been. And yet, from that uncertainty, Mara forged herself into someone who understood the precariousness of life and the precision required to survive it. As the war erupted around her, Mara witnessed horrors that would have broken many adults. Entire towns burned, families scattered, and the sky above often glowed red with the reflection of violence. Soldiers moved with both strategy and brutality, often targeting the weakest, the women, the children. Mara's survival instincts, honed by years of living in the shadows, allowed her to avoid capture, to slip unnoticed past patrols, and to disappear into forests that had become extensions of her own mind. By the time she was 16, she was no longer simply a runaway or a fugitive. She had become a strategist, an observer, and a silent predator in a world built to kill anyone who did not conform to its cruel hierarchies. The first of the Confederate officers to note her presence had been Captain Roland Mercer, a man whose name would later be whispered with both anger and disbelief among soldiers. Reports came in of ambushes, supply lines destroyed, and men vanishing with no trace. Soldiers who had encountered her described a woman of unassuming size, whose eyes seemed to hold centuries of knowledge, and whose movements were almost imperceptible. Yet in the fog of morning or under the moonlight, she could strike with lethal efficiency. By the winter of 1863, the rumors had solidified into legend. Mara Ellison had killed, either alone or in coordination with Union forces, nearly 200 Confederate soldiers across multiple engagements. Every time, she left no signature, no body count, no indication of her presence beyond the whispers of the frightened and the frantic. Some thought her supernatural, some dismissed the stories as exaggerations, but the officers could not ignore her, and the soldiers feared her. It was not just the killings that made Mara notorious, it was her methods. She relied on meticulous planning, utilizing the terrain, weather, and timing to her advantage. She set traps that could immobilize squads before a shot was fired, poisoned supply caches so that armies would falter long before reaching their objectives, and move through the land in ways no pursuer could anticipate. She studied patterns, learned patrol schedules, memorized river crossings, and even studied the local wildlife to predict the movements of her enemies. The combination of her upbringing, her intellect, and her relentless drive to survive made her a figure impossible to catch or control. Mara's reputation grew as she became a ghost in the war-torn South. Soldiers recounted stories in hushed tones about a woman who could disappear into swamps or climb trees and stay hidden for days while enemy troops searched blindly. Some spoke of her as though she were invincible, immune to the dangers that felled men routinely. Others were more practical, noting the precision with which she struck and vanished, leaving devastation and confusion in her wake. Her Existence challenged the assumptions of the Confederate militias, and even of the Union officers who had, at first, doubted her capabilities. Here was a young black woman underestimated at every turn, whose knowledge and agility outpaced armies trained in strategy and armed to dominate the countryside. She became a lesson in the cost of underestimation, a living proof that the most dangerous adversaries were often the least expected. By late 1864, her legend had spread to the Southern Night Raiders, a private militia known for patrolling rural areas and hunting down those who defied the Confederate cause. They had been sent to intercept her, believing that she was a threat that must be eliminated before it could spread further. 40 men, well-armed, confident, and seasoned in violence, moved together under the cover of darkness, convinced that capturing or killing a lone woman would be their triumph. They did not anticipate the meticulous nature of her preparations, nor did they anticipate her complete understanding of human psychology and warfare. Mara had anticipated them. She had anticipated every patrol pattern, every detour, every assumed blind spot. Her preparations were not reckless but systematic, a culmination of years spent studying, surviving, and thinking 2 steps ahead of those who underestimated her. Even before the raiders approached, Mara had mapped the terrain surrounding her hideout. She had set subtle snares, hidden pits, and false trails meant to mislead pursuers. Her awareness extended beyond the immediate physical environment. She studied the men, noting the arrogance in their movements, the false confidence in their speech, and the gaps in their coordination. It was a study in human nature as much as it was in strategy, and Mara applied every observation she had learned in her years of survival. By the time the men reached the outskirts of our location, they were already walking into a carefully orchestrated maze of danger, unaware of the invisible lines of planning that stretched between her and each of them. The woman who had been a child of bondage, who had been forced to navigate a world designed to subjugate and erase her, had now become something more than survival itself. She had become a force that demanded recognition and respect. Her legend was not built on rumors alone, but on verified actions, on the cumulative impact of her strategic attacks, and on the fear she instilled in those who sought to control the world around her. Mara Ellison had transformed her past, her trauma, and her meticulous intelligence into a weapon that no one, not even 40 armed men, could underestimate. Yet Mara's legend was as much about intellect and preparation as it was about morality and purpose. She did not kill out of pleasure or malice. She killed because the world had offered her no alternative, because each death was a step toward survival, and each victory was a statement that her life, and the lives of those she protected, could not be dismissed. Every plan she laid, every ambush she executed, and every escape she orchestrated was a deliberate act against the machinery that had enslaved her and sought to destroy anyone like her. She understood the cost, the consequences, and the necessity of her actions, and so the rumors grew. 40 men, 1 woman, hundreds of dead, yet none ever able to claim the truth directly. Only whispers, only fear, only the slow spread of a name that carried weight like thunder across the South. By the time the raiders had organized themselves, Mara was already observing them. Hidden, silent, and impossibly still, she counted each footstep, memorized every division of their forces, and noted every pattern of light and shadow in the moonlit trees. She had been preparing for this encounter long before the first soldier had even suspected her location. For Mara, this confrontation was not about recklessness or vengeance. It was about control, survival, and proving that the underestimated could command the most extraordinary outcomes. The night that 40 men believed they had cornered a woman would not proceed according to their expectations. They were stepping into a world where preparation, skill, intelligence, and unyielding resolve had already determined the parameters of the battle. And Mara Ellison, the daughter of bondage turned master of strategy, stood ready to meet them, invisible yet omnipresent, a living legend poised to etch her story yet deeper into the annals of fear, respect, and awe. The night Mara had anticipated for days finally arrived. The air hung heavy with dampness, and the moon shone pale through scattered clouds, casting a silver light that glimmered on the edges of the forest. Every leaf, every branch, every rustle was familiar to her, yet the stakes had never been higher. 40 men, well-armed, trained, and confident, marched toward her isolated cabin with the arrogance of those who believed the world owed them dominance. They were the Southern Night Raiders, a militia feared for their ruthlessness and cunning. Yet they were ignorant of one immutable truth. Mara Ellison was not merely a woman, she was a living weapon, shaped by a lifetime of survival and sharpened by necessity. She had prepared for this moment with precision, calculating every possible move they might make, and she would not be underestimated. From the shadows of the tree line, Mara observed them. She had memorized their formation over 2 days of careful reconnaissance, noting their positions, the alignment of the men in squads, the spacing of the horses, and the rhythm of their marching boots. She had seen the patterns in the way they moved together, the small habits that revealed which men were leaders, which were brash, and which were unsure. This was crucial. Understanding her enemy meant controlling the flow of the encounter, ensuring that no matter how heavily armed they were, their confidence would crumble before the first shot was fired. Mara's own body felt taut, every muscle coiled with anticipation. She had no illusions about the danger. She knew that a single mistake could cost her life. But for the first time in months, she was not running. She was waiting. She had prepared the cabin weeks in advance, transforming it into a fortress disguised as a humble shelter. The surrounding forest had been mapped meticulously, paths leading to the cabin disguised with false trails that would lead anyone who pursued her astray. Tripwires and snares, almost invisible in the moonlight, had been installed along the main approaches, designed to slow, entangle, and disorient. Each trap had a purpose, calculated to exploit the overconfidence of the men approaching. She had even arranged a series of mirrors and reflective surfaces along the periphery to give the illusion of movement, to make the raiders hesitate and second-guess what they were seeing. Mara understood that fear was as much a weapon as a rifle, and she intended to use it to full effect. The raiders approached with the arrogance of men who believed the night belonged to them. Their boots crunched on the undergrowth, the sound amplified in the quiet forest. Lanterns swung on long arms, casting shaky beams of light that danced across the trees. Mara watched, noting the spacing of the men, the slight stumbles, the casual chatter that revealed their overconfidence. She could feel the rhythm of their movements, as if she were listening to a heartbeat that she intended to interrupt, to dominate, to control. Each step they took brought them closer to the edge of her design, closer to the snares that would ensnare the unwary, closer to the illusions that would disorient their senses. The first misstep came swiftly. A young raider, unfamiliar with the terrain and eager to prove his valor, tripped over a nearly invisible rope stretched across the path. His fall was silent at first, but the snap of the rope against a nearby branch and the startled gasp that followed triggered a chain reaction. The man behind him cursed, caught in the momentum, and stumbled into the second trap, a pit concealed by thin branches and leaves, perfectly camouflaged by Mara's careful arrangement. Within moments, the illusion of control began to unravel. Mara did not move from her hiding place. She let the forest and her preparation do the work, each trap a sentence in the story she was writing in real time. The raiders' confidence began to crack. Lanterns swung wider, men shouted warnings, and the formation that had seemed so disciplined moments ago became chaotic. Mara listened to their cries, noting the rising panic and the fraying of their coordination. This was exactly as she had predicted. She had studied the psychology of soldiers in panic, the way fear could spread through a group like wildfire, and now she could see theory becoming reality. Her traps were not designed merely to harm, they were designed to create doubt, hesitation, and disorder. She understood that the most dangerous enemy is not one who strikes blindly, but one who strikes after carefully observing confusion, uncertainty, and the smallest opportunity. As the men advanced cautiously, Mara moved like smoke, silent and unseen. She was a shadow, a ghost, a presence that could not be located until it was too late. Every movement had been calculated, her footing, her breathing, her position relative to the men. She did not rush, for haste was the enemy of precision. Instead, she allowed herself to flow with the chaos she had orchestrated, stepping through the shadows, adjusting traps, and observing every reaction. The forest itself seemed to bend around her, a willing accomplice in her design. She could hear the branches creak, the undergrowth snap, the sharp hiss of men realizing their feet were no longer secure. Each sound was a note in the symphony of panic she was composing. By now, the raiders were disoriented, unsure of which way to advance or retreat. Their numbers, which should have been an advantage, became a liability. Every man's movement created new hazards for the others. Every step forward risked triggering a hidden trap. Mara watched the leader attempt to restore order, his voice rising in command, but it was too late. The rhythm of the men was broken, their discipline shattered, and their fear magnified by the environment that had become her instrument. She had designed the night to be an equalizer, 40 men against one woman, yet all of the advantage lay in her understanding, her preparation, and her resolve. The first shots fired were not hers. They came from men in the wrong positions, panicked and reacting to shadows they could not interpret. Bullets whizzed past her position, thudding into trees and ricocheting harmlessly off carefully chosen surfaces. She remained still, allowing the forest and her preparations to filter the chaos, ensuring that the men's own actions became their undoing. When she finally moved, it was with deliberate precision, striking only where necessary and only where she could guarantee success. Each shot was calculated to incapacitate, to remove a threat, and to maintain control over the battlefield. Mara understood that victory was not measured in numbers alone, but in the mastery of the situation, the ability to remain unseen, and the capacity to manipulate fear and uncertainty to her. Advantage. By midnight, the raiders' formation was entirely disrupted. Half of the men had become entangled in traps, some immobilized, others injured. The remaining soldiers were confused and disoriented, shouting commands that no longer carried authority, their lanterns swinging wildly and casting shadows that Mara could exploit. From her vantage point in the tree line, she could see the panic etched into every face, hear the uncertainty creeping into every voice, and feel the shift of power moving entirely into her hands. She did not gloat, for she understood that the cost of arrogance in battle is high, but she allowed herself the satisfaction of knowing that preparation, intelligence, and courage had triumphed over brute force. Mara's strategy was not merely defensive, it was a demonstration of control. She manipulated the terrain to her advantage, using the darkness, the natural sounds of the forest, and the traps she had set to turn fear into a weapon. The raiders were no longer a cohesive unit, they were a scattering, a mass of men whose confidence had evaporated, leaving only raw panic. Mara's presence was felt in every misstep, every faltered command, every scream of frustration and pain. She was not attacking recklessly. She was orchestrating the outcome with deliberate, methodical intent. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. Mara used the cover of darkness to continue her assault, moving silently among the trees, placing the final elements of her traps, and observing the shifting positions of the remaining men. The forest itself became her ally, the undergrowth concealed her movements, the wind carried the sound of her enemies' confusion away from her, and the moonlight highlighted her planning without ever revealing her exact position. By the time the first hints of dawn crept across the horizon, the Southern Night Raiders were thoroughly defeated. Disoriented and demoralized, the 40 men who had approached her cabin with confidence, expecting an easy target, had been outmaneuvered by one woman, invisible and unstoppable. Mara emerged from the shadows only after the last man had fled or been incapacitated. She surveyed the scene calmly, methodically, ensuring that no one remained who could pose a threat. Her strategy had worked perfectly. The raiders' arrogance had been their undoing, and her preparation had ensured that no unnecessary risk had been taken. Every trap, every observation, every calculated movement had culminated in a victory that few could believe. The forest returned to silence, save for the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant call of a night bird, and the faint echoes of men who would never forget the lesson they had learned. Mara Ellison was not to be underestimated. By the time she returned to the cabin, she was already planning the next steps. Survival demanded constant vigilance, and she knew that the night's victory, as spectacular as it was, could not lead to complacency. The lesson she had imparted to 40 armed men would ripple outward, ensuring that the legend of Mara Ellison continued to grow. She did not celebrate, for celebration was a luxury reserved for those who were safe for more than a few hours at a time. Instead, she prepared, strategized, and reinforced the cabin, readying herself for the inevitable challenges that lay ahead. Mara Ellison had not always been the shadow that haunted soldiers, the phantom who could strike unseen and vanish without a trace. She had been a child, small and fragile, born into the crushing weight of enslavement in Mississippi, a place where life was measured not in years but in usefulness. Her earliest memories were of fields stretching under a relentless sun, overseers wielding whips, and authority with equal cruelty, and the sound of her others quiet, weeping in the corner of the cabin. Her mother had been strong even in the face of suffering, but strength alone could not shield a child from the world's horrors. Mara learned quickly that the smallest movement could betray her presence, that silence could save her, and that knowledge, secret knowledge, could be more powerful than strength alone. Even as a girl, she observed patterns, the way the overseers moved, the cadence of the master's boots across the floor, the precise times when guards rotated shifts. Everything was a system, and understanding the system could mean survival. Her mother taught her small lessons in reading and listening, lessons that were hidden from the eyes of anyone who might punish her for learning too much. She learned to memorize words, to trace letters with her finger on rough surfaces, to store information in her mind as if it were a precious commodity. Mara's curiosity became a weapon in its own right. She observed the hierarchy of the plantation and realized that the world would not wait for her to grow strong. It would crush her unless she adapted, unless she became clever, cautious, and unbreakable. These lessons, learned in secrecy, shaped the foundation of the woman she would become. Intelligence and patience were her first tools, the skills that would later allow her to navigate forests, evade patrols, and manipulate fear in men who believed themselves superior. When Mara was 12, her mother was sold to another plantation, torn from her permanently, leaving Mara in a cabin with strangers and overseers who had no interest in nurturing a child. It was during this time that Mara's understanding of the world crystallized. She realized that she could not rely on anyone else to protect her, that survival required independence and initiative. The first time she hid in the woods overnight to escape punishment, she discovered the rhythm of the trees, the way the wind carried scents, and the patterns of light and shadow across the forest floor. That night, Mara felt a thrill she could not yet name, the thrill of control over her own destiny, however temporary, however fragile. She had escaped a cruel overseer, but more importantly, she had tasted freedom, even if only in a fleeting sense. The experience changed her. She began to see the world not as it was presented to her, but as a puzzle to be solved, a system in which she could find openings and exploit them. By her mid-teens, Mara had developed skills that would later define her legend. She could move silently through forests, read the movements of men and animals alike, and anticipate danger before it arrived. She became an expert in observation, learning to note every detail: the placement of a guard, the angle of a moonbeam, the faint scent of smoke or sweat that betrayed human presence. She experimented with rudimentary traps, learned to fashion snares, and even studied the habits of predators to understand the psychology of fear and pursuit. She understood that her size, her age, and her perceived weakness could be turned into advantages if she thought strategically, if she learned to manipulate expectations. Every step she took, every shadow she used, every sound she masked was a lesson in the art of survival. Mara's first real taste of combat came during a local skirmish between Confederate soldiers and Union scouts. She had observed both sides for days, hiding in the woods, studying movements, and noting weaknesses. When a small detachment of Confederate soldiers approached, Mara acted decisively. Using the terrain to her advantage, she set traps that immobilized several men, then struck with surprising force, knocking down a soldier who had underestimated her. Her intervention saved the lives of Union scouts and disrupted enemy operations. Though she was nearly caught herself, Mara's precision and understanding of human behavior allowed her to escape unscathed. That event marked the beginning of her reputation as a deadly, cunning operative capable of turning small forces into catastrophic losses for her enemies. The stories of her early exploits spread quietly at first, whispered among Union officers and Confederate deserters alike. She became a figure of both fascination and fear. But Mara was not motivated by fame or legend. She was motivated by survival, by the desire to reclaim agency in a world designed to strip her of it, and by a quiet rage that had been building since childhood. Each life lost in battle at her hands was not a thrill, it was a necessity. She understood that violence was often the only language in which her enemies would listen, and she wielded it with restraint and precision, never carelessly. Her intelligence allowed her to strike where the enemy would be least prepared, to exploit their expectations, and to leave them demoralized and disorganized. Her reputation, while terrifying to her enemies, was a byproduct of meticulous planning, not a goal in itself. Mara's methodology was comprehensive. She studied geography, memorized patrol routes, and observed the habits of both man and animal. She adapted quickly to changing circumstances, using the environment to conceal movements and mislead pursuers. She understood that psychological warfare was as important as physical confrontation. A single well-placed trap, a shadow glimpsed at the edge of vision, or a false trail could disrupt entire militias. Mara used sound, light, and perception as tools, manipulating enemy assumptions and feeding their fear. In doing so, she became more than a participant in the war. She became a force that shaped the behavior of her adversaries without ever revealing herself fully. By late 1863, Mara had begun operating in a network of allies, primarily Union scouts who recognized her talents and courage. She was invaluable for reconnaissance, infiltration, and sabotage. Her understanding of human nature and terrain allowed her to lead missions that would have been impossible for ordinary soldiers. Mara did not join out of allegiance alone. She joined because the network provided her with resources, information, and a broader platform for survival and resistance. Each mission refined her skills, increased her confidence, and allowed her to test strategies that would later be used against the 40 men who would come to her cabin. Her reputation as a ghost, a specter, and a deadly strategist grew. Confederate forces began to spread rumors of a black woman who struck like lightning and vanished, like mist, a figure whose very presence inspired fear, disbelief, and obsession. Yet even as her skills and reputation grew, Mara remained grounded in purpose. She did not take lives lightly, and each action was deliberate. She understood the moral complexities of war and the personal cost of violence. Mara's resolve was born from necessity, but tempered by a strong ethical compass shaped by the injustices she had endured. She recognized the humanity in those she fought against, even when they represented the machinery of oppression. This awareness made her not only a more effective combatant, but also a more formidable opponent. She anticipated reactions, understood psychology, and maintained the composure necessary to turn fear into an ally rather than a vulnerability. By the time the Southern Night Raiders sought her out, Mara had already become a master of deception, strategy, and improvisation. She had faced men twice her size, navigated hostile territories, and survived repeated attempts at capture. Every skill she had acquired from childhood observati, on from the early lessons taught by her mother, and from real-world experience in war, had coalesced into a lethal proficiency. Her awareness of terrain, human psychology, and strategic planning made her uniquely capable of handling situations that would overwhelm most seasoned soldiers. The encounter that would unfold was not the result of luck or chance. It was the culmination of years of preparation, discipline, and a lifetime of learning how to survive in a world that had tried to erase her existence. Mara's transformation from a frightened child into the South's worst nightmare was not instantaneous. It was painstaking, methodical, and deeply personal. She learned to trust her instincts, to read the intentions of men and women around her, and to move with precision and confidence. She mastered both the physical and psychological aspects of survival, creating a synergy between thought and action that made her a formidable adversary. By the time 40 armed men approached her cabin, she was not only prepared, she was inevitable. Her story was not one of mere survival. It was a testament to the capacity of a determined mind and body to turn oppression into empowerment, fear into strategy, and survival into legend. The night was alive with tension, a charged stillness that Mara could feel in her bones. The forest seemed to hold its breath as 40 armed men approached her cabin, their boots crushing the fallen leaves, their lanterns swinging and casting long, quivering shadows across the trunks of ancient trees. Mara Ellison had waited for this moment with a patience born of necessity, every heartbeat measured, every breath deliberate. She had prepared the forest as a trap, using its natural contours, undergrowth, and the darkness as her allies. Every path, every clearing, every obscure trail had been studied, memorized, and manipulated so that even the most confident soldier would falter if they were not cautious. But caution, Mara knew, was a luxury seldom afforded to men who believed themselves invincible. The raiders thought they were in control, but they were already inside her carefully constructed web. She crouched in the shadows, her figure blending seamlessly with the bark of the trees. Her eyes tracked each movement, noting the spacing of men, the alignment of horses, and the placement of lanterns. The faint snap of a twig, the whispered exchange of words, the occasional cough, each sound was information. Her mind processed it all, calculating outcomes, anticipating mistakes, and preparing responses. Mara did not fear them, she understood them. Each raider's body language, posture, and rhythm revealed confidence or hesitation, strength or weakness. She had studied human behavior for years, learning how men react under pressure, how fear propagates through a group, and how a single disruption could unravel even the most disciplined formation. The first man to encounter her trap did so with arrogant carelessness. He stepped on a barely visible rope stretched across the path, triggering a snare that hoisted him off the ground and left him dangling helplessly. Mara watched silently as the man struggled, his shouts echoing through the trees. Panic spread quickly. The second man, attempting to assist, stumbled into a pit concealed beneath a thin layer of leaves, crashing with a grunt into the trap Mara had crafted days earlier. The third man froze, uncertain whether to advance or retreat, while the men behind him faltered, unsure how to respond. Mara's plan unfolded perfectly. She did not move. She allowed the environment, the traps, and the reactions of the raiders to do the work of disorientation. Her knowledge of terrain and psychology had given her the advantage, and she wielded it like a weapon sharper than any rifle. E-men's confidence began to crumble. Lanterns swung erratically, illuminating the chaotic scene. Voices rose in command, but orders were shouted into confusion. The group that had marched with discipline and arrogance was now a collection of men scrambling to regain composure, unsure of what dangers lay before them. Mara noted the fear, cataloged it, and let it settle. She did not need to be seen to control the battlefield. The traps, the shadows, and the carefully planned lines of sight ensured that every movement they made worked against them. Each mistake they made increased her control, and she moved with the certainty of someone who had spent her entire life predicting outcomes and exploiting weaknesses. The forest became an extension of Mara's mind. She moved silently among the trees, her presence undetectable, a ghost in the moonlight. Every step, every subtle movement was intentional. She repositioned her traps as necessary, adjusted lines of sight, and observed the raiders' shifting positions. The men were trapped not only physically but mentally. Their fear and confusion magnified every sound, every shadow, every whisper of wind. Mara had become more than a woman fighting for survival. She had become a master of perception, shaping reality for her enemies without revealing herself. They were reacting not to her presence directly, but to the environment she had meticulously orchestrated. Panic had become their greatest vulnerability. One of the raiders, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, tried to regroup the others, barking commands that went ignored or misinterpreted. Mara observed him closely, noting the confidence in his voice and the slight tremor in his hands. She waited until he moved into the perfect line of sight before she struck, releasing a tripwire that sent him sprawling into a concealed pit. His screams echoed through the forest further, destabilizing the remaining men. Mara moved silently to a higher vantage point, her body blending with the shadows of the trees, and watched as chaos continued to unfold. The panic was contagious. Men shouted, ran in the wrong directions, collided with one another, and fell into traps with increasing frequency. Her meticulous planning had turned the raiders' numbers into a liability. Their arrogance had ensured their downfall. The night stretched on, hours passing as Mara maintained control over the unfolding scenario. She did not rush. Speed was secondary to precision. Each action she took was calculated, each trap triggered at the perfect moment to maximize disorientation and minimize her exposure. Bullets whizzed past her position, some fired in desperation, but none found their mark. Mara had anticipated the angles, the likely movements, and the points from which they would fire. Her calm, deliberate composure contrasted sharply with the chaos engulfing the raiders. By the time the first hints of exhaustion set in among her enemies, she had already determined the next phase of her plan. To ensure that the disoriented men could not regroup, that their panic would compound, and that every possible exit or escape route was controlled, Mara's strategy relied not only on physical traps but also on psychological manipulation. She created illusions of movement, using shadows, reflections, and natural sounds to give the impression of her presence in multiple locations simultaneously. Men who tried to advance were met with conflicting signals, unsure of where she truly was or how many opponents they faced. The forest itself became an ally, every tree, every shrub, every fallen branch working with her rather than against her. She had mastered the ability to use the environment to her advantage, turning natural features into instruments of confusion and control. The raider, convinced of their superiority, were now ensnared by their own assumptions and by Mara's meticulous orchestration. As the night wore on, fatigue set in. The raiders, once confident and organized, were now a fragmented group, moving hesitantly, unsure of each other's positions and increasingly desperate. Mara continued to exploit their mistakes, adjusting traps, repositioning herself, and observing the outcomes of every movement. Her understanding of human behavior allowed her to anticipate reactions, to provoke fear, and to maintain psychological dominance. The men's disorientation became her most powerful tool, as panic amplified every error, every misstep, and every moment of hesitation. Mara had become the embodiment of the fear they had underestimated, a force they could not see, predict, or control. By midnight, the raiders were completely disrupted. Half were trapped or immobilized, some injured, and the rest scattered, uncertain of their position. The commanding officers had lost cohesion, the men's confidence shattered, and their fear magnified by the forest and the invisible enemy that controlled every move. Mara moved silently among them, observing, ensuring that no one could regroup, and preparing for the final stage of her plan. She did not engage recklessly, she engaged with precision, striking only where necessary, and allowing fear and confusion to do the rest. Her mastery of strategy and psychology had ensured that she maintained complete control over the battlefield, even without being directly seen. As the first hints of dawn crept through the forest, Mara's presence remained undetected, yet her control over the situation was absolute. The raiders, defeated and demoralized, began to retreat, abandoning those who were trapped and fleeing into the woods, uncertain of what had occurred. Mara surveyed the scene calmly, ensuring that no threat remained. No man capable of returning to challenge her. Every trap had functioned as intended, every calculation had proven accurate, and the outcome had been determined long before the first footstep had been taken toward her cabin. The 40 men who had approached with confidence and aggression were now broken, humiliated, and incapable of pursuing further. Mara's mastery extended beyond immediate survival. She had created a legend. The story of 40 men, armed and confident, being undone by a single woman, invisible and precise, would spread among soldiers and civilians alike. She had demonstrated not only her lethal capability, but also her intelligence, preparation, and understanding of human behavior. The Battle of the Forest was not won by brute force, but by strategy, anticipation, and the complete manipulation of her enemy's perception. Mara Ellison had not only survived, she had transformed the night into a demonstration of her unmatched skill, turning fear, chaos, and terrain into extensions of her own will. By the time the sun rose, the forest returned to quiet, disturbed only by the distant sounds of retreating men and the faint echoes of panic that lingered in the air. Mara moved through the trees, ensuring the wounded were beyond recovery, the traps reset for any potential pursuers, and her cabin secure. She had not celebrated. There was no time for triumph in such a world. Her victory was a testament to preparation, intelligence, and patience, but it was also a reminder that survival required constant vigilance. The 40 men had come with confidence, believing in the superiority of their numbers, their weapons, and their arrogance. Mara had shattered every assumption, demonstrated the power of preparation and intellect, and ensured that her enemies would think twice before underestimating her again. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale light across the shattered forest, Mara Ellison emerged from the shadows, her presence unannounced and unnoticed by those who had survived the night. The forest was littered with the remnants of her meticulous orchestration, snapped ropes, collapsed pits, overturned lanterns, and the faint echoes of panic that still lingered in the air. The 40 men who had approached with arrogance, weapons drawn, and confidence in their numbers were gone. Some fled into the distant woods, some trapped, injured, or humiliated beyond recovery. Mara moved with deliberate caution, her senses still alert, scanning the terrain for any threat that might have escaped her attention. Though the immediate danger had passed, her vigilance remained unwavering. The night had proven that even a single miscalculation could be fatal. She had survived, yes, but survival was never passive. It demanded constant awareness, constant adaptation, constant readiness to act. Mara began her methodical sweep of the area, ensuring that every potential escapee could not rally and return. Her traps, though temporarily disturbed, were reset and reinforced in case the surviving men attempted to return with reinforcements. She moved with the fluidity of someone whose body and mind were trained to react as one, each step purposeful, each breath controlled. The forest had become an extension of herself, a familiar companion in which she could navigate silently and invisibly. She checked each snare, each pit, each improvised barrier, confirming their positions and making subtle adjustments to ensure maximum efficiency. Mara understood that legend was not only born in the moment of victory, but also in the careful management of aftermath, in the demonstration of thoroughness and intelligence that made her enemies fear her beyond the immediate confrontation. The survivors, those who had fled into the trees, were disoriented, fearful, and unable to coordinate. They stumbled through the undergrowth, their numbers reduced by panic and missteps, their morale shattered. Mara watched them from a distance, unseen, calculating whether any could regroup and pose a threat later. Her knowledge of human behavior allowed her to anticipate their likely paths, predict their exhaustion, and estimate the time before they would realize the futility of pursuit. She did not taunt them, did not give them the satisfaction of confrontation. Her dominance was complete not because she had struck each one, but because she had orchestrated a night in which fear itself became her ally. By controlling the perception of her enemies, she had gained victory without direct engagement in every case. It was a strategy of precision, patience, and psychological mastery. Mara's next task was practical but no less critical, securing her immediate refuge. The cabin she had used as a base was reinforced and fortified, but she knew that lingering in one place for too long would invite renewed attention. She moved through it methodically, checking every entry point, concealing weaknesses, and preparing for any approach that might come from those still tracking her. Supplies were gathered, ammunition checked, and maps updated with the latest information about patrol routes, terrain obstacles, and potential threats. Mara's preparation was meticulous because she understood that survival was cumulative. Each precaution taken now would pay dividends in the days, weeks, and months to come. Her actions reflected not recklessness or bravado, but an unwavering commitment to ensure that her victories could be sustained, that her freedom would not be fleeting. Once she had secured her immediate environment, Mara prepared for departure. She could not remain stationary. The events of the night had made her presence known, and even whispers of her victory would attract attention. Her escape had to be as deliberate and controlled as her confrontation had been. She selected a route through the forest that minimized exposure, taking advantage of natural cover, shadow, and the irregularities of the terrain. Each step was calculated, every pause deliberate, ensuring that no sound betrayed her presence. Mara's intimate knowledge of the land, combined with her acute observation skills, allowed her to move with an efficiency and stealth that would make pursuit virtually impossible. Even seasoned trackers would struggle to follow her path, misled by false trails and subtle diversions she had prepared in advance. As she moved away from the cabin, Mara reflected briefly on the magnitude of what had occurred. 40 armed men, confident and trained, had approached to eliminate her, and yet she had outmaneuvered them all. The lesson was clear: preparation, intelligence, and psychological mastery could outweigh brute strength and numbers. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a symbol, a figure whose reputation would precede her wherever she went. Mara's actions were not motivated by fame, but the legend that would emerge was unavoidable. Those who had encountered her or even heard tales of her exploits would spread the story, amplifying her presence in ways that required no additional effort. Fear, when coupled with myth, became a powerful shield, deterring future threats and reinforcing the narrative of her invincibility. Mara's journey northward began in earnest. She navigated forests, rivers, and abandoned roads, moving always with caution, always with awareness. She encountered the remnants of war-torn towns, the silent devastation of abandoned homes, and the occasional patrol seeking her or others like her. Each encounter required careful navigation, stealth, timing, and patience were her constant companions. She relied on her skills of observation to detect danger before it could detect her. Her knowledge of human behavior allowed her to anticipate movements, identify potential ambushes, and exploit gaps in enemy coordination. Every mile she traveled was a testament to her discipline and the cumulative knowledge she had acquired over a lifetime of survival. Along the way, Mara encountered those who would aid her, individuals who recognized her skill, intelligence, and determination. They provided shelter, information, and supplies, though always discreetly, as they too understood the danger her presence invited. These interactions required delicate negotiation, subtle communication, and careful assessment of trust. Mara did not extend her reliance lightly. Every ally was evaluated rigorously, ensuring that any assistance received would not compromise her safety. Her network, though small, was effective, and it allowed her to move with greater efficiency, avoid unnecessary risk, and sustain her efforts over extended periods. The combination of her personal skill, and her strategic alliances made her not only a survivor, but a figure of influence, capable of shaping outcomes even without engaging directly in combat. By the time Mara reached safer territory, she had begun to cultivate the aura that would define her legend. She avoided direct confrontation when possible, allowing the memory of her exploits to precede her. The stories of 40 men defeated by a single woman traveled faster than she could, spreading through soldiers, civilians, and scouts alike. People whispered about her intelligence, her precision, and her ability to manipulate both environment and human behavior to her advantage. Mara understood the power of narrative. Fear and respect could be as effective as physical action in eating enemies and ensuring survival. Her reputation became a shield, a tool as vital as any rifle or trap she had ever used. Those who might have pursued her hesitated, considering the impossible odds they would face against someone of her skill. Despite the physical and psychological toll of her actions, Mara remained resolute. She did not rest long in one place. The forest, the rivers, and the paths she traveled demanded constant adaptation. Every step required calculation, every decision carried weight. She learned to read the subtle cues in the environment, the way the wind shifted, the pattern of animal movement, the distant sound of human activity. These observations allowed her to avoid confrontation unless necessary, to move undetected, and to maintain the initiative in any encounter. Her mastery of her surroundings became an extension of her strategic genius. The land itself seemed to yield to her will, providing cover, guidance, and advantage at every turn. Over time, Mara's legend grew, not only because of her extraordinary feats, but because of her ability to remain elusive. She became a ghost story, a figure who existed both in reality and in the imagination of those who had faced or feared her. Tales of her victories, her traps, and her unmatched cunning spread across towns, military outposts, and through whispers in the forest. She was described as invisible, unstoppable, and precise, a woman who could single-handedly defeat men armed with rifles and confidence. Mara's power lay not in sheer physical strength alone, but in her intelligence, preparation, and ability to control perception. She had turned fear into a weapon and the forest into an ally, proving that even a single person, properly prepared and determined, could achieve feats beyond ordinary comprehension. Mara eventually settled temporarily in a remote cabin deep in the Appalachian foothills, a place she had scouted in advance, isolated from major patrol routes yet rich in resources for survival. Here, she reflected on the events that had solidified her reputation. The night she had faced 40 men had been a culmination of years of preparation, training, and careful observation. Her actions had not only preserved her life, but had demonstrated the power of intelligence, strategy, and psychological insight. Mara understood that her survival depended on continued vigilance, adaptability, and the ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. The forest and her skills became inseparable, a living testament to her mastery of both herself and her environment. Though the world around her was torn by war, Mara found a sense of purpose in the knowledge that she could navigate, manipulate, and survive in even the most hostile circumstances. Her victories were not celebrated with fanfare or recognition. They were internalized as proof of her capability, her intelligence, and her resilience. The legend of Mara Ellison, the woman who had outmaneuvered 40 armed men, would endure long after she moved on, a testament to the power of preparation, courage, and the indomitable will to survive against overwhelming odds. In every whisper, every fearful recounting, every tale of impossible survival, Mara's story became larger than the individual herself, a symbol of mastery over circumstance, environment, and human expectation. She had proven that one person, armed with intelligence, preparation, and determination, could stand against forces far greater than themselves and emerge victorious.